This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for August 4th, 2022. And for this update, I will be joined by Mark Sleboda. He's a U.S. Navy vet. He now resides in Russia, Moscow to be exact. In the Navy, he had been doing nuclear engineering. Now he teaches international relations and security at Moscow State University. Let's hear a little bit about Mark's background, and then we will get into the issues of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment.
First, Brian, thanks for having me. I've been a fan of yours forever, back to the Land Destroyer days. So it's
mutual. It's mutual.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be on. And I think you've done great work with the new Atlas. First, I just want to, I'm not actually an expat. I've immigrated to Russia several years ago. So technically I'm a Russian citizen now. But full disclosure, when we're talking about Ukraine, I am not 100% objective. I cannot be. My wife is from the Crimea. My in-laws live in Simferopol, and we have family all over East Ukraine, Donbass, Kharkov, Odessa. So while that, definitely does not put me in the line of an uninterested observer, it also gives me, I think, an insight into the people of East Ukraine that never accepted the U.S.-backed putsch that overthrew their government that they had overwhelmingly elected back in 2014. Their opinions are completely politically repressed in Ukraine. They have been since then. And when they're not politically oppressed, they're actively being fired on and have been for the last 8 years. They are dismissed as pro-Russian separatists in the Western media or as Russian proxies. But polls at the time in 2014 conducted, as reported in the U.S. then owned and run Kiev Post, a very pro-Maidan newspaper, admitted that a majority or a plurality of the Ukrainian population, polled by polling groups still used today, different polling groups taken during the Maidan, all showed that a majority of Ukrainians, a slim majority, but a majority opposed the Maidan. So despite the idea that everyone in Ukraine supported this revolution of dignity, the way the buzzword, because some people get dignity and others not so much, there was significant political opposition to the overthrow of what they consider the last legitimate democratically elected government. And that is the perspective that they work from. They don't accept this regime. They have never accepted it, my family in East Ukraine. They were extremely upset with the Putin administration for not doing anything in 2014, 2015 to help them when their government was overthrown by an openly foreign-backed putsch. Of course, they do not want to be caught up in a war. No one does. At the same time, they have to give it their grudging support because they want this regime gone. They don't want to be part of an anti-Russian Ukraine where the forces, the militant and political forces that undergird the regime, that are its vanguard and brown shirts, regard them as subhumans because they are Russian speaking, Russian identity, East Ukrainians. And ethnicity really doesn't mean anything, right? In this area. My wife's family, they consider themselves Russian, but they actually have a Ukrainian surname. And if you look back in their history, there's Russians, there's Ukrainians, there's Tatars, there's even an Uzbek in there. They are a Soviet mutt family, as is much of East Ukraine, it must be said. So it's not a matter of them being um, Russian speaking or Russian ethnic. It's more about identity and worldview. And Ukraine has long been a country divided along national identity lines. Nearly, you can look at it geographically between West Ukraine and East Ukraine, with Central Ukraine not really having a firm identity and willing to go whichever way the current political winds are blowing in the country. But the Western Ukrainians, they were not part of Ukraine up until 1938, 39, right? The run up to World War II. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before that, and very briefly then Poland, and then the Soviet Union. And they have their national identity conception is almost centered around hating Russia. I mean, that's the primary facet of it. Meanwhile, East Ukraine has a completely different national identity conception. A significant portion of the population of Eastern Ukraine is ethnic Russian, and those that aren't largely view Russians as just a kindred people. They don't really understand the border separating the two areas. They are Russian speaking. They don't want to be part of a country that's enemies with Russia or that regards genocidal, Holocaust perpetrating Banderite fascists like Stepan Bandera as their heroes, the founding fathers of their nation state, because they fought against that. And the Banderites, the OUN, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, they didn't just kill Poles, and they didn't just kill Jews. They didn't just kill leftists. They killed other Ukrainians. That's the bottom line. They killed particularly East Ukrainians. And my family, my wife's family, has members that were shipped off as slaves to serve in the German industrial complex, but they weren't rounded up by Germans. They were rounded up by West Ukrainians. They were rounded up by the Banderite battalions. So there is this very heated national identity divide in Ukraine. Any attempt to paper it over or deny it is just complete propaganda. I theorized, I talked about, it was long talked about. There were science fiction conventions in Ukraine talking about a future civil war in Ukraine because everyone knew it was coming. The country was internally and externally balanced between East and West, right? Both domestically and geopolitically between the West, which supported the Western Ukrainians, even if many of them were ultra-nationalists, and Russia on the other side. And when I was doing my postgrad at the LSE, I was running a crisis scenario for the London International Model United Nations. And the scenario I ran was a civil war in Ukraine, where Donald Trump was the president, where Russia and NATO entered on opposite sides of the conflict, and that was in 2010.
Yeah. So, well, actually, Mark, this is a great place to start. I usually end my updates by refreshing people's memory on how all of this started, how Russia did not start a war in February of this year. They intervened in the middle of one. And as you said, and I've heard you say this elsewhere, that these are not neo-Nazis. You know, when the Western media talks about the extremists, they refer to them sometimes as neo-Nazis. But as I have heard you say, they're old school Nazis. I mean, they are Nazi Nazis. And this is a very serious issue. And this was something that Russia got into in February, and it wasn't a decision taken lightly, and it wasn't on a whim, and it is not a conflict of choice, not from my point of view. So I think it's good that you've said very upfront your perspective, and I think it's good that we get a perspective from the other side, because all we hear in the Western media is from one single side, and then the other side is just completely dehumanized, that as you've kind of mentioned. So How about are you familiar with Defense Politics Asia?
Yes.
Okay, let's take a look at the map where things stand right now. That's how I usually start these updates. Um, there's this supposed counteroffensive taking place around Kherson, and I don't see any evidence of that. I don't see any evidence of that. Not on this map, not even on the pro-Ukrainian live UAmap.com. I don't see it. So the things have been pretty static around here. I have heard that Russia is reinforcing the area with battalion tactical groups, possibly for an offensive, maybe not even for a defensive. We can talk about that. Around Donetsk city, which has been tormented for 8 years, there has been, I think they said that there has been a breakthrough here at Avdiivka, which is a heavily fortified point along the line of contact. I think it's interesting that Russia was able to break through there. I didn't think that they would do that until they were done in northern Donbas.
Everyone thought that was the plan.
Yeah. And maybe, and this is just a theory, and until more facts come in, maybe it's because Ukraine is siphoning forces off the line of contact in the east
exactly
to bring them to Kherson.
Yes.
And then that's also reflected in Bakhmut and Seversk and the Russian gains all along there. And also around Kharkov, there's news from both sides that Russian activity is picking up there. So, Mark, you want to talk about why we might be seeing that? I mean, you pretty much just said it, but maybe you want to elaborate.
Yeah. So the West has been demanding some return on their investment, and you have to remember that the West originally, the Kiev regime said that they needed a couple months ago $5 billion a month to keep afloat. Now they've upped that to $10 billion, and that's on top of the tens of billions of dollars of arms that have been sent to them. So they're kind of demanding a Ukrainian victory that they can take back to their own people and say that this is worth it, that this can be won. Because all you're hearing in the Western mainstream media about the course of the conflict is the most absurd Baghdad Bob level propaganda imaginable, right? Now, this doesn't mean that you should only listen to the Russian Ministry of Defense, because they leave out a few things too, particularly when it doesn't look good for them. But by and large, they've been a lot more honest than the stuff, the ghost of Kiev, the Snake Island martyrs, the bombing of Baba Yar or Chernobyl type 100% disinformation that we've heard out of Kiev and echoed like the dutiful stenographers that they are by the Western mainstream media. There has been no counteroffensive, though, in the South, like has long been promised, like Kiev has been promising the West. The terrain is awful. It's an awful pick for a counteroffensive. It is flat steppe, which does not give any advantage to a defender with less artillery, practically no armor, where your opponent has air dominance, if not complete air superiority. It basically results in suicide run by infantry, and that infantry is forced conscripts. I mean, let's be honest. The vast majority at this point, all of the professional brigades have suffered, by their own accounts, as reported in the Western mainstream media, 70-80% attrition. And everything has been filled by territorial defense and forced conscripts. And a clear sign that Ukraine is winning, that the Kiev regime is winning, is that they have upped the conscription age from what it previously was at 60 to now 75, because that's what the winning side does, right? Is push your grandfather and his walker out of the nursing home and into the combat field. But so they've been making a lot of noise. Arestovich, Zelensky's brain advisor, has been all talking about a Kherson offensive. It has not materialized. There have been several attempted counterattacks that were premised by begun by trying to cross the Ingulets River there, coming south from Krivoy Rog, an industrial town, down into Kherson. It required crossing the Ingulets River. They were beaten back every time. They have made no territorial gains. They have suffered very heavy casualties. There was a big disagreements between the Ukrainian top general, their equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Zelensky, saying that an offensive is stupid at this point, and I want no part of it because it will just result in sending boys into the meat grinder. We'll be much better off defending. An offensive would only be for political reasons, not strategic reasons, and it's bad. And lately, you will hear that the Ukrainian officials are starting to talk back the idea of an offensive. Oh, there'll be an offensive, but first there has to be a long war of artillery. Insert, some grandiose comments about the HIMARS and how they've managed to take out one bridge, at least at a surface level. Not structurally. Then, we can't launch an offensive because the Russians are massing for an attack on Nikolaevsk. So we can't launch an offensive right now. Nonetheless, they have been siphoning troops off for what they planned as an offensive from the front in eastern Ukraine against the advice of the Ukrainian generals. Because they had to have this offensive. And the result is that most of those troops that were gathered, they have been hit by Russian artillery and standoff strikes, cruise missiles, airstrikes, while they were still sitting up near Krivoy Rog and suffered horrible attrition. And they're no longer capable of an offensive if they ever were. They can't do combined arms maneuvers. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russian and allied Donbass forces took advantage of this. And while their focus was originally presumed to be this second defensive line, well, it's the first defensive line from their side. There are two defensive lines left in Donetsk. And the first one runs from Seversk to the Soledar, Bakhmut, or Artemovsk urban agglomeration, and then will trail down eventually to Advayevka. But when they saw this siphoning off of troops, they actually launched attacks at Soledar, at Bakhmut, and at Advayevka in the south, the most heavily fortified Ukrainian position over the last 8 years. It is where they shelled Donetsk city out of. When you keep hearing about Donetsk city being shelled, it is an urban area, urban industrial area, small city, not far from Donetsk. It's essentially the Donetsk suburbs. And they've been stuck there. And it was explained that doing a frontal assault on this was simply suicidal, that all the artillery in the world from that position couldn't successfvely denigrate the fortifications there to allow it. So instead, they went up through Lugansk, they took out Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, then they moved to the second defensive line here. But the withdrawal of so many of the combat-ready troops that Ukraine had left, the Russian allied Donbass forces saw an opportunity and they took it, and they have pushed through, penetrated at Pesky, which is again a heavily fortified area around Advayevka. And what they're basically do is spreading out in an arc around Advayevka, and they're now moving at it in the suburbs, basically from all sides. And it is a very serious penetration. The Ukrainians are very worried about it, the Kiev regime, and the West is not talking about it at all because they don't want to admit it. But it is extremely significant. But at the same time, they're also moving and encircling Bakhmut, where they've taken several of the settlements around there, and now they are in close quarters fighting. The softening up period is over. They are in close quarters fighting in the outskirts of Bakhmut itself. The same thing in Soledar, and it is very significant Russian advantages through these fortified, built up defenses. You hear all the time, oh, Russia is only making marginal progress, only slow progress. They are, because they're pounding through very tight urban industrial areas in East Ukraine with built up fortifications. The important thing to understand is that when these are gone, when these last two defensive lines are gone, there is nothing comparable anywhere else in Ukraine to these defenses. On top of that, all of the Kiev regime's best troops and their best equipment was here to stop Russia right at this point. And it will all be attritioned out of existence. And then we'll actually probably see Zelensky go to some type of negotiation table, if Russia will even talk to him at that point, because they will have nothing left capable of defending like it has been in East Ukraine. And any presentation by the Institute of the Study of War, the British Ministry of Defense, trying to depict Russia as, not succeeding because they're going so slowly here, is completely, out of line with the context of the scope and the type of conflict that's going on right now, and what happens when the Russian forces achieve victory here, and they almost assuredly will and are. And it is a matter of a couple of months. It's something that we will see before the winter. And then the question is, they will go to the West and they say, do we go on or are you done? And if they don't get a positive response, then it will be on to Kharkov or Odessa, one or the other. And all of East Ukraine will be taken. But at this point, we've also heard from the Russian government, not only that Kherson and Zaporozhye will be, and other territories will be given referendums to join Russia, but they've also said, we will liberate the Ukrainians from this regime. So they are now talking regime change. And the former Russian president and prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who has turned very hawkish and very acerbic, still head of the National Security Council, has recently posted maps on Telegram social media channel, putting up what the Kiev regime thinks Ukraine will look at the end of this war, and what it will actually look at, and Ukraine is reduced to a tiny rump state around Kiev, and that Medvedev is not an insignificant figure. And we have also heard from the leadership in Donetsk People's Republic, Pushilin, already talking that we need to take back all of the historically Russian cities, which certainly includes everything on the east bank of the Dnieper. And it is a logical geographical dividing point.
How about headlines like this? This is the president of Ukraine. It's just hell. He's talking about how, regardless of these HIMARS coming in, and this is what you were kind of talking about around Kherson. They have this talk about how the HIMARS are going to give them the upper hand in this long-range fighting, but of course it's not going to. And this is the president of Ukraine admitting this openly, even after receiving 4 more HIMARS systems, that they're still at a complete disadvantage. And then, of course, in this article, they're also talking about the economic aspects, not just for Ukraine, but for its Western sponsors, regarding the sanctions that have completely boomerang back and hit
Zelensky's choice of language there is very specific, because there was a Ukrainian reporter in Pesky who wrote the truth of what the conflict in East Ukraine and Pesky looks like, and how bad the position is for the Ukrainians. And he used exactly those words. And in his letters from the front in Pesky, he talked about how he fully expected to get a bullet in the back of the head now for saying what the regime in Kiev doesn't want to say. And this is from someone who considers that all of his friends are dead in the trenches. He's very, pro-Kiev. He's simply upset that they have nothing left. There's no artillery to fire back with. There's no shells. They even all the troops being sent to the front, they don't even all have guns. We've heard from Western mercs that sometimes 2 troops are sent with 1 AK-47 between them. Now, certainly those are probably the territorial defense, because there is a hierarchy of gear, and the best gear goes to the ultranationalists, to the Banderite fascist battalions, because they are the ideologicals. They're the ones who will fight to the end, to the death. And the regime in Kiev knows they'll get much bigger impact if they're fully equipped, and they have been, but it hasn't really helped, say, Kraken around Kharkov, who has been just pounded by Russian standoff strikes and suffered big, huge casualties in recent days. And you mentioned Kharkov. It does seem that some satellite image that there is a big Russian armored buildup above Kharkov. Armor's not going to do them much good in storming Kharkov. I don't think they really intend to do it that way. But there is the possibility, one, it's, again, to just simply divert troops, or it could be used to lance down into on either side of Kharkov, either along the front south from Izium into the upper part of Slavyansk against the defensive lines from the north there, this last defensive line, the second one, or they could have other intentions of another major territorial breakthrough with armor just in general Ukrainian space up to the Dnieper. So that is something to watch. And what is really incredible is that Russian and Donbass forces are making all of these advances around, penetrating the lines at Avdiivka, which is huge, around Bakhmut, which is heavily defended as well, Soledar, and at the same time building up forces around Kharkov and beating off every paltry attempted counterattack in the south, all at the same time, without ever increasing beyond the 200,000 troops that the intervention force originally went with, and that's counting 40, 50 some thousand from the Donbass, from Lugansk and Donetsk. So that's pretty amazing, and it shows what little offensive power that the Kiev regime forces have left. That, the level of the training, they've got no officers anymore. They've got no NCOs. They're down on 3rd and 4th commanders of any battalion that had any combat, training or experience. And it's really a bad situation for them. It's one of those that, I keep seeing pictures, that they're certainly not going to show you on the Western media, the pictures that my wife never wants to see. And I don't feel any joy from it. Unless they've got a tattoo of Azov or, one of the Banderite fascist symbology, because every Ukrainian death, conscript or not, that is not a Banderite is a tragedy that did not and should not have happened, but was also somewhat inevitable when the domestic political balance, internal and external, that Ukraine existed on since independence was shattered in 2014. It was pretty inevitable.
Yeah, and by design, I would say. I mean, the West has always said that in their policy papers that Ukraine was one of these flashpoints that they could use to extend Russia. Now, I want to shift to this. I like to go through I'm called a Russian propagandist, but most of my analysis is based on these. Yeah, is based on a U.S. Department of Defense Pentagon briefing. So this is from July 29th, and they haven't been doing these very often these days. And they're talking about Kherson. So let's listen to what they said about Kherson around July 29th, and now we can look in hindsight and see how accurate this was. So they say, and they're talking to the Western media when they say this: you have all been reporting on the advances that the Ukrainians are making around Kherson, and we have seen, and they're not large, giant advances, but they are certainly advances against the Russians. And even at the time when I was reading this, I had no idea what they were talking
What
about.
what town? What settlement? Name it.
Exactly. They do this every single briefing. Every once in a while, there will be something specific, and we'll never hear the end of it. When there is something specific, Snake Island, even though that was a non-victory, it was a non-victory, is inconsequential, but they would constantly refer to that. But this is very ambiguous, nothing specific. And, there were articles like this from CNN that actually contradicted what the Pentagon was saying. This one, war for the South, Ukraine sets its sights on regaining cities and towns lost to Russian troops. And if you go through this, they're basically saying that they're outgunned, they're out of everything, they have nothing to do this with, and yet somehow they're going to still do it. And that's pretty much how every article by the Western media has been reporting about this Kherson offensive. Let's see. There was the HIMARS attack on the prison holding Ukrainian soldiers. There were a lot of theories about this. I personally, until there's a full investigation, my idea is that it was probably an accident, a misidentified target. Someone in the loop made a mistake. But
No,
Mark, seems like you have an alternative. So let's hear what your point of view is on this.
Okay, so who was hit is quite specific. It was Azov.
Yeah.
And Azov was starting to do a lot of interviews with, as prisoners of war, but obviously talking freely and increasingly bitterly about the Zelensky regime in Kiev, Arestovich. They were naming figures. They were talking, who approved atrocities and what they did, and so forth. And it has to be remembered that in Azovstal, in Mariupol, Azov surrendered first, and then Zelensky announced that he was allowing them to surrender. There is no love lost there, right? Zelensky's relationship with Azov and the rest of the battalions from the beginning has been, one that both sides considered they were using the other for their own influence from the beginning, but both obviously saw the other as an eventual threat that will have to be dealt with. And Zelensky viewed the Banderites the same way. I mean, he did famously, he did an interview where he said, some Ukrainians think Bandera is a hero, and or many Ukrainians, he said, and he says, that's cool. And that's normal, and that's cool. Okay, well, it's neither. It is not neither. It is cool. It is not normal. It is Holocaust denial. It is, it is complete rewriting of history. In this project to manufacture a 100% anti-Russian Ukrainian nation, and if Zelensky could get rid of Azov when they were supposed to be the martyrs that died to a man in Azov, and get them to shut up and blame it on Russia, because the Western mainstream media will just report whatever he says without any criticality whatsoever. They will somehow believe that Russia used artillery to bomb their own prisoner of war camp, or the Donbass prisoner of war camp, rather than, I don't know, if they wanted to shoot them or to hang them or whatever, in order to cover up the torture there. Okay, there is no torture. The International Committee to the Red Cross has access there, right? They were reporting on these people, investigating them regularly as prisoners of war. If they were actually being tortured and killed the way we have seen the Kiev regime battalions do to Russian troops, because they filmed it themselves and uploaded it, we would have heard about it. That is quite obviously not what was happening. And we've seen plenty of videos, them talking freely, again, pointing figures at Zelensky and the figures in there. They wanted them gone. the regime in Kiev has been bombing Donbass for the last 8 years. They have it down to a science, right?
Yeah.
They're not missing anything. They're hitting
Okay.
exactly what they intend to hit, right? They know it very well. What's more, they agreed with the authorities in Donbass where the Ukrainian prisoner of war camp would be.
Okay.
Exactly. They knew exactly where it was. They knew exactly which barracks to hit. This was entirely intentional. And what's more, we've learned in recent days that the U.S. has veto power over
Yeah.
every single HIMARS launch. And that's coming from the Western media, whether to hit it or not. So not only is the Kiev regime certainly responsible, but the U.S. is more than culpable. They are directly responsible as well.
Yeah. I have a question then, because Azov and the its subsidiaries, and Kraken, I think it's an extension of Azov, and the other extremist right-wing Nazi groups, they will see this. What is the blowback, and how does it unfold from here? Is this going to cause additional fractures already in a very volatile system that is under strain? How do you see this going forward? And I mean, the Ukrainian population, whoever is still supporting all of this, how do they see this? Do they believe that Russia did this, or do they suspect the government did this deliberately? How does all of that work out?
Yeah, I think this is one of those where a lot of people know what really happened, but don't want to admit it even to themselves because of war, right? They will justify anything. I'm sure that a lot of Western journalists understood what really happened there. I'm sure that a lot of the far right battalions, they know as well, but a lot of them, and they've suffered really terrible attrition. In the last couple of months, even especially in the last month themselves, there is certainly the potential for, there has always been the potential for, as they refer to it, another Maidan, as an uprising against Zelensky. But they're all stuck out in the front now in very isolated positions. A lot of them aren't getting good news about what's going on, right? They're certainly not hearing it from their own Ministry of Defense. And in a lot of places, while they do have phones, in others, they've been removed entirely. So I don't expect anything at the moment, right? Once the Donbass is fully liberated, and then perhaps Russia and the Donbass forces move on to Kharkov and Odessa in East Ukraine, and you're left with a complete loss. Then you might see something, whatever is left of the far right forces at that point, trying to get rid of Zelensky and salvage some rump government in West Ukraine, some Galicia reborn or something like that. But at the moment, they're still, the close enemy, which for them now is Russia, and they will have to have an accounting with Zelensky, I think, later down the line. I think they also understand at this point that they're probably kind of locked with him, because it is very difficult to see the West, whatever the relationship between Zelensky and Biden, which is reportedly not very good, and I can see that at a personal level. Just for PR and information war, they are stuck with Zelensky. They've turned him into some type of Churchill reborn figure in the Western media. And the ultranationalists know that if Zelensky was gone, there's no guarantees of them getting weapons and getting funding, to continue their fight. So they may just take that one on the chin and tell themselves what they have to about what happened, even when they don't really believe it, because they're not getting enough to change the course of the conflict. Now, there's no way they could, because the West doesn't even have the industrial capability to change the course, even if they intervene directly themselves at this point. That's the position. I do not believe that the strike on Azov was unintentional. I believe it was Kiev. I believe it was deliberate. I think they knew exactly what they were hitting. And I think at some level, the U.S. had to sign off on it.
Yeah, you make a very compelling case. And it was interesting that the Pentagon, the senior defense official during this briefing, was saying, well, first of all, they were pushing back on reporters trying to suggest that Russia did it. They really weren't going to go along with that.
Yeah, they did.
And they were insisting that it was probably an accident. So it probably, like you said, they signed off on it and they liquidated these prisoners who were starting to talk. Now, we've already kind of talked about this, but I just want to show the disparity between what's going on the ground and what the Pentagon is telling the media, and then the media tells the public. So they're talking about the situation on the ground in the Donbas, and the senior defense official, they're being asked about this. So they say, they've gotten to a point now and have created a level of defense that really has the Russians at a standstill. They've stopped. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. We mentioned morale, we mentioned casualties. Those are certainly reasons that the Russians may have stopped. I have not seen them stop, but we'll get to that. The other reason may be Ukrainians have become very efficient in finding and killing, Russian command and control and destroying large levels of Russian materiel. So I think what we're seeing on the East is a result of that. And then if you just look at the axes from Izium, those defenses have been stalwart now for coming up on 3 weeks. So the Russians, again, have been able to make very little progress. Well, you've already kind of talked about this, but even Voice of America was talking about progress Russian troops are making around Bakhmut. And we have watched, even on the pro-Ukrainian liveuamap.com, them talking about breakthroughs along the line. So what is it? Why is the Pentagon why are they doing this at this late stage? What do you think is the thinking at the Pentagon in the UK? People are still trying to get more out of this conflict.
Yeah.
Keep this going. Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah, it's this whole keep Ukraine fighting to the last Ukrainian conscript, thrown into the meat grinder there. And that's exactly the way that Ukrainian reporter that I mentioned to you before in Pesky referred to it as a meat grinder. People who the only thing they have left to slow the Russian advance is their own bodies, right? That's what's being thrown literally at Russian forces at this point. At some point, you would think that there has to be some type of accountability, some moment where they can no longer maintain the fiction and explain why it's been so wrong continually from the beginning, for so long. But again, this goal is to keep them there as long as possible. And we've heard one reason why from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Austin himself, who said the goal is to weaken the Russian military. Okay, right. Yeah, there's an extent of that, although the U.S. knows very well themselves that actually combat experience builds militaries, right? That's how they've become the most powerful military in the world, not just money, but by continually using the military all over the world in repeated conflicts so that they are continually growing and evolving with combat experience and officers and NCO corps that have that experience. That's very important. The Chinese, for example, have none of that. They have no combat experience, and they will have to go through a test of fire eventually. But the Russians military may very well come out of this stronger than ever before. But the goal is actually, and somewhat counterintuitively, to get as many Ukrainians killed as possible. Yes, the U.S. government wants as many Ukrainians killed as possible. Why? Because when this is over, Russia at some level is going to have to govern whatever territory falls into their lap at this point. And it was always going to end in the partition or the Balkanization of Ukraine. It's now just a question of where. It's not just Donbass at this point. It's Donbass in the south, Kherson and Zaporozhye, likely Kharkov and Odessa as well. they've pretty much made it so that Russia has to take Odessa by giving Harpoon anti-ship missiles to the Kiev regime. That is in a threat to the Black Sea Fleet that cannot be allowed to exist. So eventually Russia will have to take Odessa as well. And thank you, because I want to see Odessa liberated. They've given the Kremlin really no choice on that. But they have to win back the hearts and minds, particularly of central. They know they can't win the hearts and minds of Western Ukrainians, but of the central Ukrainians that did not take the Russian side, but who they believe could still be won back. And they are elevating what they're doing in Kherson and Zaporozhye, right? It's not Russian military commanders ruling over cities there. It is the politicians, the political forces of East Ukraine, the old party of regions, the old Communist Party of Ukraine that were the dominant politicians in East Ukraine until 2014, that have been politically repressed since then, that have been elevated back up into power. The way that the Kiev regime elevated the political forces that had lost the last election, right? The governor of the Russian-held Kherson right now is the old mayor of Kherson City, and he was a deputy, a Rada deputy, and a congressman, if you will, for the Reborn Party of Regions faction, which was the opposition bloc until he was, cut out. But they've got to govern this area again, whether it's directly or through Eastern Ukrainians, who are re-elevated to positions of political authority. And every Ukrainian soldier, conscript, volunteer, whatever, that is killed by Russians or Donbass forces in conflict is a Ukrainian family that hates Russia forever. You can't get around whatever their position was before that. Then they've lost family, and it becomes increasingly hard for Russia and Eastern Ukraine to govern in the aftermath. And that is their thinking. Their thinking here is actually long-term. That it's extremely cynical, evil, you could even say. But that is their thinking here. Their thinking is the long-term geopolitical flipping of Ukraine. And if they can't control it, they want to make sure that Russia can't effectively govern it.
And I think all of this fighting too is just physically destroying all of this territory. So that's another, added bonus for this.
Who's going to pay to rebuild it?
Exactly.
They're talking about that in Russia because it's going to cost a lot of money to raise East Ukraine up to Russian living standards.
Yes, absolutely. One last item, maybe we can end on covering this. Did you have a chance to listen to this podcast? Are you familiar with War on the Rocks?
Oh yeah. I mean, I actually listened to Kaufman very much in the beginning. Recently, I've kind of stopped listening to him because he's just evolved into the same propaganda as everyone else. I mean, you have to remember that Kaufman is Ukrainian himself.
Yeah. Yes.
He originally comes from Ukraine. And in the beginning, he was fairly objective. And he was one of the few other ones that back in November were saying there's going to be an intervention, which I was saying it's on the table and it is a likely outcome if the security talks with NATO and the US go nowhere. And he was right when he was talking about the intervention. But where he has gone so completely wrong is that he does not talk about the state of the Ukrainian military at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. He says he doesn't know it, but he's also admitted before that he will not talk about it for operational reasons. And without any type of assessment and comparative assessment with the state of the Kiev regime forces compared to the state of Russian forces, then there's just no validity to what he's saying at all. And he's started to sound like the rest of the media at this point and become a broken record. And it's a real shame because last year, for instance, when there was that big spring buildup, he and Rob Lee were the only ones in the West who were getting it right that there was not going to be an intervention then, that it was mostly that it was deterrent to deter a Kiev regime assault on the Donbass. And at the time it was. But there were qualitative and quantitative reasons why the next buildup starting in November were very different. So that honesty made me, put some faith in them in the beginning, but they've gone completely south in the last 3 months. It's sad, actually.
I started listening to him at the very beginning, late February, and almost every podcast that they put out since then. And it's interesting because at one point, Ryan Evans and Michael Kaufman were like, "Yeah, it's over. Ukraine just has to do some mopping up." And now let's go back to the podcast title. Now it's Ukraine's window of opportunity is a question mark. There's no more certainty anymore, and that's all they talk about throughout this entire podcast. So they talk about Ukraine is shifting forces to Kherson for this offensive, and it's going to put pressure on Russia, their offensive in the east and their defense around Kherson. And I'm just thinking, of course, but also it's going to put pressure on Ukraine's defense in the Donbas region. And of course, it's going to, how effective is that offense going to be around Kherson? So that was one major point that I picked out. And they seem oblivious to this. They were talking about the destruction of these bridges, and again, like you said, how effective do you think that is? What impact is destroying these bridges?
An annoyance. It is
an annoyance.
First of all, the bridge over the dam there has never been destroyed to begin with, and that's a rail, and that's the main advantage. But Russia simply put up 2 pontoon bridges and a pontoon ferry. It's the Russian military. You don't think they're capable of crossing a river if they have to? The idea that if they were going to, stop or, more realistically, even throttle the supply lines to Kherson City, and that was going to allow them some great victory to retake Kherson City on the other side of the Dnieper, with what? they don't have the armor. They don't have any air force whatsoever left, right? A couple of planes that fly a couple of sorties a day. And again, their refusal to talk about the state of the Kiev regime military, about the attrition, about the lack of equipment, about the morale. And you don't have to read RT or Sputnik, although you can hear me on Sputnik, all the time, and you'll be better off that way. But listening to the Western mainstream media at this point should tell you that you're hearing nothing but propaganda. So the best place that you can go to listen or read in English is Telegram, and you're looking for something in English, reporting I don't want to say objective, but more honest source. And you know them very well. I know they have a relationship with you as well. Slavyangrad. They're in English. They are done. They were started back in 2014 by Gleb Bazov, a Ukrainian, or should I say East Ukrainian Canadian, that has been active from the very beginning. I consider him a friend. I know he's always retweeting New Atlas as well. If you want to get it from a source that is filtering through all of the Russian language stuff, and providing a degree of, he doesn't just repost everything in English. He filters through it himself, and only when he sees good confirmation, and he has not been afraid to call out the Russian Ministry of Defense on bullshit on the few occasions that they have been guilty of, wartime propaganda themselves. And he called it right, I think, pretty much every time. So if you're looking for something in English to read direct from the source, you can't go wrong with Gleb Bazov on Slavyangrad on Telegram.
Yes. Okay, so let's just plow through the rest of this war on the rocks the points. We'll put all the links to that in the video description below, as well as all the links to where you can find your work as well. They were talking about how this might possibly, just like you said, this is them trying to show a return on investment, possibly. And they also said maybe it's trying to disrupt the referendum in Kherson, create panic, create terror, create doubt. And people aren't going to vote no because they want to remain part of Ukraine. They're just worried about the consequences.
Yeah, they're worried about return. That's what Russia
Yeah.
has to continually reassure them, is that the Kiev regime, that Azov, that Carpathia siege, that Idar tornado, that they're not coming back. And that's what they're really afraid of there to a very high degree. I, for one, do not think you're going to see referendums this fall. I don't think that there is organization or political consolidation enough. Zaporozhye, for instance, Zaporozhye city is, still firmly in Ukraine's hands, and it's going to be, I think, not till after winter until that can be liberated, certainly so the next spring. So I don't think you're going to see it. I think that is a bit of Russian psy war and disinformation at this point as well. But I don't think that that's actually going to happen. But there certainly is an impetus on the Kiev/Western side to disrupt it if it was going to happen. So that is, another rationale for a much ballyhooed, never materialized counteroffensive in the South.
Okay. And what I thought was interesting is over time, Michael Kaufman has become much more sober about what is going on. And in this podcast, he talks about how he admits, probably for the first time or one of the few times he has mentioned, Ukraine's best trained forces are being decimated. They're taking heavy losses, and this is going to have an impact. And in the past, he has said that reconstituting these forces was no big deal. You had all of this equipment coming in. You just match a number for the brigade of men onto the equipment, and you've got a brigade. And now he seems to finally realize that takes years of training, especially the leadership components of a brigade. Brigade is pretty big. And that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take years. You cannot reconstitute that. Yeah. And then he talked about the British training 2,400 every 3 weeks. And when I heard that, I thought, I thought they were going to train 10,000 Ukrainians for 4 months. Yes. But no, 3 weeks. That's suicide. That's criminal.
We're both. We're both U.S. veterans, right? You were a Marine. I was Navy. We had to cart you around to get you there. But how long was your basic training?
It was 3 months.
Yeah. How long was your A school?
Well, that was 9 months. But before that, I had to do another month of combat training, and I wasn't even in infantry. So that's 4 months for me.
Okay. I was in, a nuclear reactor operator, nuclear engineering, a little more technical. My schooling was 2 years. So but this is not even qualifying them for basic infantry. Not even, right? Not even. This is putting a gun in their hand and teaching them to pull off the safety and fire it and how to dig trenches. That's what they're teaching them at this point. How to survive artillery and in the best way possible, because it's impossible to say how to survive, how to try to survive the type of artillery barrages with again, this Ukrainian journalist said that there were some 7,000 shells a day falling just on Pesky. And that's what destroyed their defenses there. That's what they're teaching them, because that's all they can teach them in 3 weeks. And we all thought it was going to be the bare minimum, but 10,000 troops over 4 months. No, it's 2,400 troops every 3 weeks. It's a joke. It is a sick joke.
Yeah, criminal. It's absolutely criminal what the British
and when you see military analysts, all right, forget the media and the defense correspondents, because we know that they're all BS artists themselves. When you have Kaufman and others not coming right out and saying that these are not trained troops, that this is suicide, that this is meat grinder, cannon fodder stuff, and it's cruel, then they lose all credibility in my eyes. It's really sad what's
I
happening.
agree. I agree with that. And I was an electro-optical ordnance repairman. My MOS school was 9 months, and I was taught about javelin, tow missile, night vision. And this is what's kind of given me some insight on these heavy weapons, the training involved, and how hard. Because when I got done with, you think, wow, 9 months, that's a lot. But when I got to the fleet, I didn't know anything. I still had to learn everything from the beginning all over again. So that when they're talking about giving them jets and HIMARS and M777s, they might be able to operate it, but never effectively. It took them years to integrate Bayraktar into their. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. What are your thoughts on this?
The first counter battery fire that hits one of those units, even if it doesn't destroy it, kills the few people that they have to operate it.
Yeah.
Right? They have no logistics supply chain to maintain and do repairs. We've heard firsthand from the Ukrainians themselves, for instance, for the German artillery pieces that break apart, that are simply not capable of the type of constant firing demand that the front is calling for them. And they just have to go back to Poland, months away, for being repaired. So a military is more than just a couple of HIMARS on the front. And you yourself did an excellent job of pointing out how the Russian Tornado is actually superior to the HIMARS system anyway. And it's the complete dishonesty in the military reporting when they're talking about all of this. And I mean, forget the basic infantry, the no supply chains, the incapability to replenish. They've got no NCOs and officers corps, because you certainly can't build them up in 3 weeks. I mean, that's a joke. And no one is talking about this. Why are the only ones talking about these hard realities of combat ex-US military people outside of the brass spectrum, like you, like Scott Ritter, like me, who know firsthand the way militaries really work, that they run on logistics, that they run on training, and experience, and none of these things are anything that you can't. Russian and Donbas forces have already effectively destroyed a Ukrainian army that was trained and built up over 8 years. And now they're attempting to reconstitute an entirely new military out of untrained civilian conscripts with a trickle of gear that is completely foreign to them.
Yeah.
And is coming from
a hodgepodge of it.
A hodgepodge.
Yeah.
Some German, a few Swedish pieces here, some American pieces, some British pieces, that none of it is. It actually points to a whole lot of interoperability problems with NATO itself, but that's another issue. It's just so absurd when I listen to, again, supposed military experts in the West gloss over all of this and try to come up with, well, the Russian morale is high because they're winning, because they regularly recycle their frontline forces. This week, it's the Chechens and the LDPR, the Lugansk People's Republic people at the front. Last week, it was someone else, or 2 weeks before that. They recycle them. They've got time off. They get resupply. They get a chance to take showers, and maybe even in some cases, get family visits and so forth. They get some rest from the front. That is not the case for anyone in the Kiev regime military forces. And that is why all of these comments, the Russians are exhausted after this one, they're not going to be able to go any further, coming out of Kaufman again and again and again.
He said that multiple times. Yeah.
Yes. So minimal gains completely takes, again, out the scope of the Ukrainian defenses that have been built up for 8 years, and where the majority of their troops and gear from the whole country was concentrated in this one spot. And Russia's still grinding through it. Another settlement, a town, every day or every other day. They're not on anyone else's timetable. They're not on a 24-hour news cycle timetable. The Ministry of Defense is just doing its brutal, methodical work.
Well, we've gone over an hour. I will definitely do everything in my power to have you back. I want to share with my audience your work, where they can find your work. Mark, The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda. It's on YouTube. The link will be in the video description below. You're also on Twitter. You're also on Telegram. Those 3 links will be in the video description below. Is there anywhere else people can find your work, Mark?
Well, I'm on Sputnik radio shows just about every day, several times, sometimes several times a day, on the Critical Hour, on Political Misfits, on Fault Lines, on Backstory, on By Any Means Necessary. They're good people there, and I'm still on RT and CGTN and Press TV every once in a while too. But you do that circuit as well, I'm sure.
Okay. And if I can get you back on the new Atlas as well. So thank you so much for your time, sharing your expertise. And again, we hope to have you back. Thanks again.
Thanks again. Longtime fan, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.